The desert sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Dr. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her brow, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat against the relentless Arizona heat. She had been working at the remote medical clinic on the San Carlos Apache Reservation for 3 months now, and each day brought new challenges that her medical school training had never quite prepared her for. The clinic was a small, weathered building that served a community spread across miles of rugged terrain, where modern medicine met ancient traditions in ways that sometimes clashed and sometimes beautifully harmonized. Sarah had come here not by choice initially, but as part of her residency requirement to serve in an underserved community. Fresh out of her emergency medicine residency in Boston, she had expected to spend a year in a rural clinic somewhere, maybe in Vermont or upstate New York. But when the assignment came through for the Apache Reservation in Arizona, her supervisor had looked at her seriously and said it would either make her a better doctor or break her completely. There was no middle ground in a place where the nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and helicopter evacuations were sometimes impossible due to weather or mechanical issues. The reservation was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Coming from the Northeast, where everything was green and close together, the vast expanses of desert, mesas, and sky seemed almost alien. But more challenging than the landscape was navigating the complex cultural dynamics of providing medical care to a community that had every reason to distrust outsiders, especially white doctors who came and went with little understanding of Apache ways. In her first weeks, Sarah had made mistakes. She had rushed through consultations, not understanding that building trust required time and patience. She had dismissed traditional healing practices as superstition, not realizing how deeply intertwined they were with the community's approach to health and wellness. Several patients had simply stopped coming to see her, preferring to travel the long distance to other clinics rather than deal with a young doctor who seemed to see their culture as an obstacle rather than an asset. But Sarah was nothing if not determined. She began staying after hours to read about Apache history and traditions. She reached out to the tribal elders and traditional healers, initially receiving polite but cool responses. Slowly, very slowly, she began to understand that effective medicine here required more than just clinical knowledge. It required respect, patience, and a willingness to see healing as something that involved not just the body, but the spirit and community as well. The breakthrough had come when she successfully treated a difficult case of diabetes in an elderly woman named Maria Begay. Rather than simply prescribing medication and expecting compliance, Sarah had worked with Maria's family to understand their concerns about pharmaceutical interventions. She learned that Maria was worried the medicine would interfere with traditional ceremonies that were crucial to her spiritual well-being. Together, they developed a treatment plan that honored both medical necessity and cultural values, adjusting medication timing around ceremonies, and incorporating traditional dietary practices that actually complemented the medical treatment. Word of this success spread through the community's informal networks, and gradually, more patients began coming to the clinic. Sarah learned to listen more and talk less, to ask questions about family and traditions before jumping into medical assessments, and to work collaboratively with traditional healers rather than competing with them. On this particular day, the clinic was busier than usual. A stomach flu had been making its way through the community, and Sarah had seen a steady stream of patients with dehydration and gastrointestinal symptoms. She was just cleaning up after treating a family of 5 when she heard the screech of brakes and urgent voices outside. Through the clinic's front window, she saw a pickup truck with its door flung open. A man was lifting a small child from the passenger seat, and even from a distance, Sarah could see the urgency in his movements. The child appeared limp, and the man was shouting something in Apache that she couldn't understand, but the terror in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah rushed outside, her medical training kicking in automatically. The man was tall and lean, with long black hair tied back, and wearing jeans and a work shirt that were dusty from what looked like construction work. His face was etched with panic as he held the child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. "Help, please," the man said in English, his accent thick with emotion. "My son, something bit him. He was playing, and now he cannot move right." Sarah immediately took the child, feeling his weight in her arms as she carried him quickly into the clinic. The boy was conscious but clearly in distress, his breathing rapid and shallow. His skin was flushed, and she could see he was struggling to focus his eyes. "What's your son's name?" she asked as she laid him on the examination table, already reaching for her stethoscope. "Tommy," the father replied, hovering anxiously beside the table. "Tommy Crowfeather. I am Joseph, his father." Sarah nodded, beginning her assessment while trying to keep her voice calm and reassuring. "When did this happen, Joseph? And do you know what bit him?" Joseph's hands were shaking as he ran them through his hair. "Maybe 30 minutes ago. We were at the construction site where I work. Tommy was playing near some rocks while I finished up. I heard him cry out, and when I ran over, he said something bit his leg. By the time I got him to the truck, he was having trouble walking." Sarah's mind was racing through possibilities as she examined Tommy. Snakebite was an obvious concern in this environment, but as she looked at the child's leg, she saw something that made her blood run cold. On his small calf, she could see 2 small puncture wounds surrounded by redness and swelling, but more telling was the pattern of inflammation. This wasn't a snake bite. "Joseph, I need you to think carefully," she said, continuing her examination while monitoring Tommy's vital signs. "Did Tommy see what bit him? Did he describe it at all?" Joseph knelt beside the table, speaking softly to his son in Apache. Tommy's response was weak, but Joseph's face grew even more worried. "He says it was small and moved fast. He said it had a tail that curved over its back." Joseph looked up at Sarah with growing fear. "That sounds like a scorpion," Sarah finished, her heart sinking. Of all the creatures in the Sonoran Desert, few were more dangerous to a small child than a bark scorpion. Their venom was neurotoxic, and children were particularly vulnerable due to their smaller body weight. Sarah had read about scorpion envenomation during her preparation for working in Arizona, but she had never actually treated a case. She knew that bark scorpion stings could cause severe neurological symptoms, including muscle spasms, difficulty breathing, and, in the worst cases, respiratory failure. Time was critical, especially for a child Tommy's size. She quickly checked Tommy's reflexes and found them hyperactive, a classic sign of scorpion envenomation. His pupils were dilated, and she could see involuntary muscle movements beginning in his arms and legs. The child was scared and trying not to cry, but she could see the pain and confusion in his young eyes. "Joseph, I need to be honest with you," Sarah said, turning to face the father directly. "I believe Tommy has been stung by a bark scorpion. This is a serious medical emergency. He needs anti-venom treatment, and he needs it soon." Joseph's face went pale. "What does that mean? Can you treat him here?" Sarah's heart ached as she shook her head. "I don't have the anti-venom here. The closest hospital that stocks it is in Phoenix, and even that's not guaranteed. We need to get him there immediately." "Phoenix?" Joseph's voice cracked. "That's 2 hours away, maybe more. And I don't have, my truck is old, and I don't know if it would make it that far in this heat." Sarah was already reaching for her phone, calling for helicopter evacuation, but she knew that even in the best circumstances, it would take time for a helicopter to reach them, and time was something Tommy didn't have. As she waited for the dispatcher to answer, she watched the child's condition continuing to deteriorate. His muscle spasms were becoming more pronounced, and his breathing was growing more labored. The call confirmed her worst fears. The medical helicopter was currently involved in another emergency and wouldn't be available for at least 90 minutes. Ground ambulance would take even longer due to the remote location of the reservation. Sarah looked at Joseph, then at Tommy, and made a decision that went against every protocol she had been taught. She couldn't wait for professional medical transport. She would have to provide supportive care and hope they could keep Tommy stable during the drive to Phoenix. "Joseph, here's what we're going to do," she said, moving quickly to gather supplies. "I'm going to come with you and Tommy to Phoenix. I can provide medical support during the drive, and we can get him to the hospital faster than waiting for an ambulance." Joseph's eyes widened. "You would do that? Leave your clinic." Sarah was already filling a medical bag with everything she might need, for fluids, medications for seizure control, airway management tools, and oxygen. Tommy needs advanced care, and he needs it now. Sometimes being a doctor means going beyond the walls of the clinic. She quickly called her supervisor to explain the situation, knowing that technically she was supposed to wait for proper medical transport. But sometimes the rules had to bend when a child's life was on the line. Her supervisor, Dr. Martinez, listened to her rapid explanation and gave his approval, understanding that in rural medicine, decisions often had to be made that wouldn't fly in an urban hospital setting. Within 10 minutes, They had Tommy secured in the back of Sarah's SUV, which was more reliable than Joseph's aging pickup truck. Sarah had started in 4-line to maintain hydration and had oxygen ready if his breathing became more compromised. Joseph sat in the back with his son, holding his hand and speaking to him in a mixture of Apache and English. As they drove away from the clinic, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was essentially providing mobile intensive care in the back of her vehicle, racing against time and venom through the Arizona desert. Tommy's life depended on her ability to keep him stable for the next 2 hours, and she wasn't entirely sure she was equipped for that challenge. The first hour of the drive was tense, but manageable. Tommy's condition remained serious, but stable, his vital signs holding steady with Sarah's interventions. Joseph proved to be a calming presence, singing traditional Apache songs softly to his son and telling him stories that seemed to relax the frightened child. But as they passed the halfway point to Phoenix, Tommy's condition began to deteriorate more rapidly. His breathing became increasingly labored, and Sarah could see signs that the venom was affecting his respiratory muscles. She had to make the difficult decision to assist his breathing, setting up a bag mass ventilation system in the cramped confines of the moving vehicle. "Is he going to be okay?" Joseph asked, his voice tight with fear as he watched Sarah working over his son. Sarah looked up at him, sweat beading on her forehead from the stress and the heat. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he is. Tommy's a fighter, I can tell. And we're almost there." As Phoenix's skyline appeared on the horizon, Sarah allowed herself a small moment of hope. They had made it this far, but she knew that the real test would come in the emergency room, where Tommy would finally receive the anti-venom that could reverse the scorpion's venom. The last 30 minutes of the drive were the longest of Sarah's career. Tommy's breathing continued to require assistance, and she found herself constantly monitoring his pulse and blood pressure, adjusting medications and oxygen flow as needed. Joseph never left his son's side, maintaining a steady stream of quiet encouragement and traditional songs. When they finally pulled up to the emergency entrance of Phoenix Children's Hospital, Sarah had never been so relieved to see a medical facility in her life. The emergency team was waiting for them, having been alerted by Sarah's radio calls during the drive. Within minutes, Tommy was being wheeled into the trauma bay, with Sarah providing a rapid handoff of his condition and treatment during the transport. As the emergency room team took over Tommy's care, Sarah found herself standing in the hallway with Joseph, both of them emotionally and physically drained from the ordeal. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency was beginning to fade, replaced by exhaustion and the sobering realization of how close they had come to losing a child. Joseph turned to her, his eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," he said simply. "You saved my son's life." Sarah shook her head. "We're not out of the woods yet. The anti-venom will take time to work, and Tommy will need to be monitored closely for the next several days." But even as she spoke, she could see through the trauma bay window that Tommy's breathing was already improving as the anti-venom began to counteract the scorpion's venom. The medical team was optimistic, and for the first time since Joseph had carried his son in her clinic, Sarah allowed herself to believe that Tommy was going to be okay. As they waited for more news from the medical team, Sarah reflected on how much had changed in just a few hours. She had come to the reservation as an outsider, someone fulfilling an obligation. But sitting in that hospital waiting room with Joseph, watching him pray in Apache for his son's recovery, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about completing her residency requirement anymore. This was about being part of a community, about understanding that medicine was more than just science and protocols. It was about being willing to risk everything for a child you had just met, because in that moment, every child becomes your responsibility. Tommy Crow Feather had become more than just a patient. He had become the reason Sarah understood why she had become a doctor in the first place. The night was long, and both Sarah and Joseph kept their vigil in the waiting room, taking turns checking on Tommy's progress and supporting each other through the uncertainty. By dawn, the news was finally definitively good. Tommy was stable, alert, and asking for his father. The anti-venom had worked, and while he would need a few more days of observation, he was expected to make a full recovery. As Joseph was finally able to hold his son again, Sarah stood in the doorway watching the reunion. She knew that this experience had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The scared young doctor who had arrived at the reservation 3 months ago felt like a different person entirely. She also knew that when they returned to the reservation, word of what had happened would spread through the community. The white doctor who had risked everything to save Tommy Crowfeather would be seen in a new light. But, more importantly, Sarah had finally found her place in this vast, challenging landscape of desert and tradition, medicine, and culture. The drive back to the reservation would be very different from their desperate race to Phoenix. This time, they would return as a family, because in the crucible of that emergency, bonds had been forged that would last a lifetime. The 3 days that Tommy spent recovering in Phoenix Children's Hospital passed like a dream for Sarah. She had taken emergency leave from the clinic, something that Dr. Martinez had readily approved given the circumstances. Joseph never left his son's side, and Sarah found herself drawn back to the hospital each day, not just to check on Tommy's medical progress, but because she felt an unexplainable connection to this small family that had entered her life so suddenly. On the second day, while Tommy slept peacefully with all his vital signs normal, Joseph had opened up to Sarah about his life. He was a single father, he told her, his wife having died in a car accident 3 years earlier when Tommy was just 3 years old. Since then, it had been just the two of them, navigating the world together with the support of Joseph's extended family on the reservation. Joseph worked construction, traveling sometimes to job sites off the reservation to make enough money to support his son. It was good work when it was available, but inconsistent. He worried constantly about leaving Tommy with relatives while he worked, especially on jobs that took him far from home. The irony that Tommy had been hurt while Joseph was working close to home, where he thought his son would be safe, was not lost on either of them. Sarah learned that Joseph was more than just a construction worker. He was also a traditional storyteller and musician, keeping alive Apache songs and legends that had been passed down through generations. In the quiet hours of Tommy's recovery, he had shared some of these stories with Sarah, painting pictures with his words of a rich cultural heritage that she was only beginning to appreciate. Tommy himself was a remarkable child. Despite everything he had been through, he was curious and resilient. As he recovered, he peppered Sarah with questions about medicine, about her life before the reservation, and about why she had helped him. His English was excellent, but he also spoke fluent Apache with his father, switching between languages with the ease of a truly bilingual child. "Why did you come with us to the hospital?" Tommy asked her on the third day, when he was feeling well enough to sit up and color in a book that one of the nurses had brought him. Sarah thought about the question seriously. It was one she had been asking herself as well. "Because that's what doctors do," she said finally. "We help people who are sick or hurt." Tommy considered this, his small brow furrowed in concentration. "But you could have sent us with someone else. Daddy says you left your work to come with us." Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. The child had identified exactly what was puzzling her about her own actions. She had indeed gone far beyond what was typically expected, even in rural medicine. There had been other options, other ways to handle the situation that wouldn't have required her to abandon her post at the clinic. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "when someone really needs help, you don't think about what you're supposed to do. You just think about what feels right." Tommy nodded, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Daddy says that's what being Apache means. Taking care of people who need help, even if they're not your family." The wisdom in the child's words struck Sarah deeply. She was beginning to understand that her decision to accompany them to Phoenix hadn't been about medical protocols or professional obligations. It had been about something more fundamental, about recognizing that in moments of crisis, artificial boundaries between doctor and patient, between outsider and community member, simply melted away. On the fourth day, Tommy was discharged from the hospital. The medical team was pleased with his recovery, and all traces of the scorpion venom had been eliminated from his system. As they prepared to leave Phoenix and return to the reservation, Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew that going back meant facing questions about her absence from the clinic, but more than that, she wondered how the events of the past few days would change her relationship with the community she served. The drive back to the San Carlos reservation was indeed different from their frantic race to the hospital. Tommy chattered happily from his car's seat, pointing out landmarks and telling Sarah about places where he and his father had camped or hunted. Joseph was more relaxed than she had ever seen him. The terrible weight of fear for his son's life finally lifted from his shoulders. But as they approached the reservation, Sarah noticed Joseph growing quieter. When she asked if everything was all right, He hesitated before answering. My family is grateful, he said carefully. What you did for Tommy, leaving your work to help us, this is not something our people are used to from doctors who come to work here. Sarah sensed there was more he wanted to say. But Joseph glanced back at his son, who was now dozing in his car's seat, exhausted from the excitement of going home. There will be talk. Good talk mostly. But some people will wonder what this means. Why you did what you did. What do you mean? In our culture, when someone saved your child's life, it creates obligations. Connections. Some people might think you're trying to become part of our community in ways that outsiders usually don't. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. She hadn't considered the cultural implications of her actions beyond the immediate medical necessity. And is that a problem? Joseph was quiet for a long moment. That depends, he said finally, on what you want, and on whether you understand what it might mean. Before Sarah could ask him to elaborate, they crested a hill, and the small cluster of buildings that included the medical clinic came into view. Even from a distance, Sarah could see that there were more cars parked around the clinic than usual. As they got closer, she realized that there were people waiting, not just patients, but what looked like a gathering of community members. Joseph saw it too. Word travels fast on the reservation, he said with a slight smile. Looks like people want to welcome Tommy home. When they pulled up to the clinic, Sarah was amazed by what she saw. At least 30 people had gathered, ranging from elderly tribal members to young families with children. Someone had hung a handmade banner that said, "Welcome home, Tommy," in both English and Apache script. Several women were setting up tables with food, and she could smell the distinctive aroma of fry bread and traditional stews. As Joseph lifted Tommy from the car, a cheer went up from the assembled crowd. The little boy, overwhelmed by all the attention, buried his face in his father's shoulder, but Sarah could see he was smiling. People surrounded them, everyone wanting to touch Tommy, to reassure themselves that he was truly all right. Sarah hung back, feeling suddenly like an outsider again. This was a family and community celebration, and despite everything that had happened, she wasn't sure where she fit in. But her hesitation was short-lived. An elderly woman approached her. Sarah recognized her as Maria Begay, the diabetes patient who had been her first real success on the reservation. Dr. Sarah, Maria said, taking her hands in her weathered ones. You brought our boy home. We all did, Sarah replied. Joseph was the brave one, and Tommy was so strong through everything. Maria shook her head. Joseph told us what you did, how you left everything to help his son. This is not something we will forget. Over the next hour, Sarah found herself at the center of more gratitude than she had ever experienced in her medical career. Person after person approached her, thanking her not just for saving Tommy, but for showing them what it meant to truly care for their community. Several people told her stories of doctors who had come and gone over the years, most of whom had maintained strict professional boundaries and never engaged with the community beyond the walls of the clinic. But the most meaningful moment came when Tommy, still weak but insistent on walking around to greet everyone, approached Sarah with something clutched in his small hand. This is for you, he said, holding out a small beaded bracelet. My mom made it before she died. Daddy says I should give it to someone who protected me like she would have. Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level, her eyes filling with tears. The bracelet was beautiful, made with traditional Apache beadwork in patterns of turquoise and silver. But more than its beauty, she was moved by what it represented: acceptance, trust, and a connection that transcended professional relationships. Are you sure? She asked Tommy. This was your mother's. It must be very special to you. Tommy nodded solemnly. She would want you to have it. Daddy says you're like family now. As Sarah fastened the bracelet around her wrist, she felt something shift inside her. The young doctor who had arrived on the reservation months ago, full of medical knowledge, but lacking in cultural understanding, felt like a stranger now. In her place was someone who had learned that healing extended far beyond prescriptions and procedures. The celebration continued into the evening, with traditional Apache songs and dances being performed around a small fire that someone had built in the open space behind the clinic. Sarah found herself sitting beside Joseph and Tommy, watching the dancers move in ancient patterns while the desert stars appeared overhead. You know, Joseph said quietly, so that only she could hear, what happened with Tommy? It's changed things for you here. People see you differently now. Sarah nodded, still fingering the bracelet on her wrist. I can feel that. But I'm not sure I understand all the implications. Joseph was quiet for a moment, watching his son, who was trying to stay awake despite his exhaustion. In our tradition, when someone saves a child's life, they become connected to that child's family forever. Not just as a friend, but as someone who has a responsibility to help guide that child's path. Like a godparent, something like that, but deeper. And it goes both ways. The family also has responsibilities to the person who saved their child. It's a bond that can't be broken. Sarah felt the weight of this revelation. She had acted instinctively to save Tommy's life, never considering that her actions might create lasting obligations and connections according to Apache tradition. "Are you okay with that?" she asked Joseph. "Having that kind of connection with me?" Joseph turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious in the firelight. "Dr. Sarah, you risked everything for my son. You treated him not like just another patient, but like he was your own child. How could I not want you to be part of his life?" As the evening wound down and people began to drift home, Sarah helped Joseph get Tommy settled in for the night. The little boy was staying at his grandmother's house for a few days while Joseph made sure their own home was completely scorpion-proofed. As she tucked Tommy into bed, the child looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Dr. Sarah, will you still be my doctor, even when I'm not sick?" Sarah smiled, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. "I'll always be here if you need me, Tommy. Always." After Tommy fell asleep, Sarah and Joseph sat on the grandmother's porch, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Coyotes called in the distance, and the air was filled with the subtle sounds of a landscape that was finally becoming familiar to Sarah. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "I mean, with the community, with Tommy, with everything?" Joseph was quiet for a long time before answering. "That depends on what you want to happen. People will expect you to be more involved now, not just as a doctor, but as someone who cares about our community's future. Tommy will want to spend time with you, to learn from you." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. But Sarah could sense there was more he wanted to say. "Andu?" she prompted gently. Joseph looked at her, and even in the dim light from the house, she could see something in his expression that she hadn't noticed before. "And I find myself hoping that you'll want to stay. Not just until your residency requirement is finished, but really stay. Make this your home." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and uncertainty. Sarah realized that Joseph was offering her something she had never expected to find in this remote corner of Arizona. Not just acceptance, but belonging. A place where she could be more than just a doctor fulfilling an obligation. As she drove home to her small apartment near the clinic, Sarah's mind raced with everything that had happened. In the span of just a few days, her entire perspective on her time at the reservation had been transformed. What had started as a professional requirement was becoming something much more personal and meaningful. She thought about Tommy's question about whether she would still be his doctor when he wasn't sick. The innocence of the question had touched something deep inside her, because it spoke to a kind of care that went beyond medical emergencies. It was about being present for the everyday moments, the scraped knees and growing pains, the school achievements and childhood milestones. And then there was Joseph. Sarah found herself thinking about him in ways that had nothing to do with being Tommy's father or her patient's family member. She thought about his quiet strength during the crisis, his obvious love for his son, and the way he had shared his culture with her without making her feel like an outsider, trying to peer in. But most of all, she thought about the sense of purpose she had felt over the past few days. For the first time since medical school, she had felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The reservation wasn't just a stop along her career path anymore. It was beginning to feel like home. As she fell asleep that night, the beaded bracelet still on her wrist, Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her life. She would stay on the reservation beyond her required year. She would build a practice that served not just the medical needs of the community, but helped bridge the gap between traditional and modern healing practices. And she would explore what it might mean to become truly part of this community with all the responsibilities and connections that entailed. Because sometimes saving one child's life is the moment when you discover the life you were meant to live yourself. 3 weeks after Tommy's scorpion incident, Sarah's life on the reservation had settled into a new rhythm that was both familiar and completely transformed. The medical clinic operated much the same as before, but the relationships she had with her patients had deepened in ways she hadn't anticipated. People lingered after their appointments to chat about their families, their concerns about their children, their hopes for the future. What had once been purely transactional medical encounters had become conversations between members of the same community. Tommy visited the clinic almost daily, usually with some small excuse. A scraped knee from playing, a question about why his stomach hurt after eating too much fry bread, or simply to show Sarah a drawing he had made at school. Joseph often accompanied him, and Sarah found herself looking forward to these visits more than she cared to admit. There was something about Joseph's quiet presence that had become a comforting constant in her days. On this particular morning, Sarah was reviewing lab results when Tommy burst through the clinic door with more energy than usual, followed by Joseph, who looked slightly embarrassed by his son's excitement. Dr. Sarah, Tommy called out, bouncing on his toes. Guess what's happening this weekend? Sarah set down her papers and gave Tommy her full attention, which always seemed to delight him. What's happening this weekend, Tommy? The sunrise ceremony. Tommy announced. My cousin Angela is turning into a woman, and there's going to be a big ceremony. Daddy says maybe you could come. Sarah looked at Joseph, who nodded but seemed uncertain. It's a traditional Apache ceremony, he explained. Very important for young girls. The whole community comes together for 4 days of ceremonies and celebrations. I thought, well, Tommy asked if you could come, and I said I would invite you. Sarah felt honored but also nervous. She knew enough about Apache culture to understand that ceremonial events were deeply sacred and that inviting outsiders was not something done lightly. Are you sure it would be appropriate for me to attend? Joseph's expression grew more serious. The ceremony is led by Angela's family, but they've given permission for you to come. They want to thank you for what you did for Tommy, and he paused, seeming to search for the right words. And they want you to understand more about who we are, about what it means to be part of this community. Tommy grabbed Sarah's hand, looking up at her with pleading eyes. Please come, Dr. Sarah. There's going to be dancing and singing, and my grandmother makes the best acorn stew, and I want to show you the mountain where the ceremony happens. Sarah looked between father and son, feeling the weight of what was being offered to her. This wasn't just an invitation to a social event. It was an invitation to witness one of the most sacred traditions of Apache culture. It was a level of trust and inclusion that she knew many outsiders never experienced. I would be honored to attend, she said finally. What should I know? How should I prepare? Over the next hour, Joseph explained the basics of the sunrise ceremony to Sarah. It was a 4-day ritual marking a girl's transition from childhood to womanhood, filled with ancient prayers, traditional dances, and community support for the young woman at the center of it all. There would be hundreds of people in attendance, many traveling from other reservations and even other states to participate. Joseph also explained the dress code and behavior expectations for visitors. Sarah would need to wear modest clothing and should bring offerings for the ceremony, usually food to share with the community or small gift for the family hosting the event. Most importantly, she would need to be respectful of the sacred nature of the ceremony, understanding that some portions might be restricted to Apache participants only. As the weekend approached, Sarah found herself both excited and nervous about attending her first traditional Apache ceremony. She had spent hours researching appropriate gifts and had decided to offer her medical services as a volunteer during the event, knowing that large gatherings often resulted in minor injuries and health issues that might need attention. She had also spent time thinking about what this invitation meant for her evolving relationship with the community and with Joseph's family specifically. Over the past weeks, her feelings toward Joseph had been growing more complex. She admired his devotion to his son, his pride in his culture, and the quiet strength he had shown during Tommy's crisis. But she was also aware that any romantic feelings she might be developing were complicated by cultural differences and her position as an outsider. Friday evening, Sarah drove to the ceremonial grounds, a beautiful area in the foothills of the Apache Mountains where Angela's family had set up a large camp. Dozens of traditional wickiups and modern tents were scattered across the landscape, with several large ramadas providing shade for cooking and gathering areas. The scene was both timeless and contemporary, with traditional Apache dwellings alongside pickup trucks and modern camping equipment. Joseph and Tommy met her as she parked, both dressed in traditional Apache clothing. Joseph wore a ribbon shirt with intricate beadwork and traditional pants, while Tommy was dressed in a smaller version of the same outfit. Sarah had never seen them in ceremonial dress before, and the sight took her breath away. They looked regal and proud, connected to centuries of tradition in a way that made Sarah acutely aware of her own cultural rootlessness. "You look beautiful," Joseph said as he helped her carry her offerings from her car. Sarah had chosen a simple but elegant dress that met the modesty requirements while still feeling appropriate for the occasion. Tommy immediately grabbed her hand and began pulling her toward the main gathering area. "Come on, I want you to meet everyone. Grandma is cooking, and all my cousins are here, and Angela looks like a princess." As they walked through the camp, Sarah was struck by the sense of community and family that permeated everything. Children ran freely between the dwellings. Older women worked together preparing enormous quantities of food, and men gathered around fires sharing stories and laughter. Everyone seemed to know everyone else, and the atmosphere was one of celebration and mutual support. Joseph introduced Sarah to what felt like dozens of relatives and community members. Each introduction was accompanied by the story of how she had saved Tommy's life, which clearly had elevated her status within the community. People treated her not as an outsider or even as an honored guest, but as someone who belonged there. The formal ceremony began that evening with traditional prayers and the blessing of Angela, who had been in preparation for this moment for months. Sarah watched from the outer circle of observers as Angela, dressed in traditional buckskin decorated with hundreds of metal jingles, was blessed by the tribal elders and began the ritual dancing that would continue for 4 days. As the ceremonial dancing began, Sarah found herself moved almost to tears by the beauty and power of what she was witnessing. The dancers moved in ancient patterns while singers chanted prayers that had been passed down through countless generations. The entire ceremony felt like a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds, a way of honoring both the individual girl's transition and the continuity of Apache culture itself. During a break in the formal ceremony, Joseph appeared at Sarah's side with 2 cups of coffee. "What do you think?" he asked, settling beside her on the blanket she had spread on the ground. "It's incredibly beautiful," Sarah said honestly. "I feel privileged to be here to witness something so sacred and meaningful." Joseph nodded, looking out at the dancers who were taking a rest before the next portion of the ceremony. "This is who we are," he said quietly. "This is what we're trying to preserve for Tommy and all the other children. When you see ceremonies like this, you understand why the health of our community is about more than just medical care." Sarah understood what he meant. Over the past months, she had learned that health in Apache culture was holistic, encompassing not just physical well-being, but spiritual, emotional, and community health as well. Traditional ceremonies like this one were as important for the community's overall health as any medical intervention she could provide. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself drawn into the community activities in ways that felt natural and comfortable. She helped serve food during the meal breaks, played with the children who were fascinated by her presence, and even learned some basic steps of the social dances that were interspersed with the formal ceremonial dancing. It was during one of these social dance periods that something shifted in her relationship with Joseph. As the drums beat and the singers called out, Joseph appeared in front of her and extended his hand. "Would you like to dance?" he asked, his eyes warm in the firelight. Sarah hesitated for a moment, aware that accepting his invitation would be making a public statement about their connection that everyone in the community would observe and interpret. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that she wanted to make that statement. She wanted the community to see them together, to understand that their relationship was evolving beyond the professional connection that had brought them together. She took his hand and let him lead her into the circle of dancers. The dance was simple enough for her to follow, a series of steps that brought the community together in a moving circle around the fire. As they danced, Sarah felt a sense of belonging that she had never experienced before. She wasn't just observing Apache culture. She was participating in it, becoming part of the ongoing story of this community. During a pause in the dancing, Sarah and Joseph found themselves alone for a few moments at the edge of the firelight. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear desert sky, and the sounds of the ceremony provided a beautiful backdrop for conversation. "Thank you for inviting me," Sarah said. "This has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life." Joseph looked at her seriously, and she could see that he was weighing his words carefully. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "Of course. Are you planning to stay here after your residency requirement is finished?" Really stay, not just extend for another year or two. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. She had been asking herself the same question for weeks, and the answer had been becoming clearer with each passing day. Yes, she said simply. I want to make this my home. Joseph's expression didn't change, but she could see something relax in his shoulders. And why do you want to stay? It was a fair question, and one that deserved a thoughtful answer. Because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The work I do here matters in ways that go beyond just treating symptoms. And this community has welcomed me in ways I never expected. I feel like I belong here. And what about Tommy and me? Joseph asked quietly. How do we fit into your reasons for staying? Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine the direction of their relationship. Tommy has become like a son to me, she said honestly. Watching him grow up, being part of his life, that's become very important to me. And you? She paused, looking directly into his eyes. You've become important to me too, Joseph. More important than I probably should admit. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah wondered if she had said too much, pushed too hard in a territory that wasn't ready to be explored. But when he spoke, his voice was warm with emotion. I was hoping you would say that, he said, because Tommy and we've been talking, and we both agree that we want you to be part of our family. Not just as Tommy's doctor, but as someone who shares our life. Before Sarah could respond, Tommy appeared at their side, slightly out of breath from running around with his cousins. Dr. Sarah, are you having fun? Did Daddy show you the dancing? Do you like the ceremony? Sarah knelt down to Tommy's level, her heart full of love for this remarkable child who had changed her life so completely. I'm having a wonderful time, Tommy. Thank you for asking me to come. Tommy grinned and threw his arms around her neck in an enthusiastic hug. Good, because Daddy and I decided we want you to come to all our ceremonies from now on. You're part of our family now, right, Daddy? Joseph smiled, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair. Yes, son. If Dr. Sarah wants to be, she's part of our family now. As the three of them stood there together under the desert stars, with the ancient ceremony continuing around them, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a scared young doctor reluctantly accepting an assignment on a remote reservation had led her to this moment. Surrounded by a community that had embraced her, caring for a child she loved like her own, and falling for a man who represented everything she had never known she was looking for. The remaining days of the ceremony passed in a blur of celebration, tradition, and deepening relationships. Sarah participated fully in all the activities that were open to her, learning more about Apache culture with each passing hour. She helped with the enormous cooking efforts that fed hundreds of people, learned traditional craft from the elder women, and spent hours listening to stories that had been passed down through generations. But most importantly, she continued to explore what it meant to become part of Joseph and Tommy's family. By the end of the 4-day ceremony, it was clear to everyone in the community that their relationship had evolved into something deeper and more permanent than anyone had initially expected. As they packed up to leave the ceremonial grounds on Monday morning, Sarah realized that she was leaving as a different person than she had arrived. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the outsider fulfilling a professional obligation. She was Sarah, Tommy's protector and Joseph's partner, a valued member of a community that had given her a home and a purpose she had never imagined possible. The transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. 6 months after the sunrise ceremony, Sarah's life had found a rhythm that felt both natural and extraordinary. She had officially committed to staying at the reservation clinic indefinitely, turning down several lucrative job offers from hospitals in major cities. Her small apartment near the clinic had been transformed into a real home, decorated with Apache artwork and crafts that community members had given her, and filled with photos of Tommy and mementos from various tribal celebrations she had attended. Her relationship with Joseph had deepened slowly and carefully, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to Tommy's well-being. They had navigated the complexities of an interracial relationship within a tight-knit community with patience and openness, always mindful of the cultural considerations that came with their union. Joseph had taught her Apache phrases and traditions, while Sarah had shared stories of her own family background and medical training. Tommy had thrived in his expanded family structure, excelling in school and developing a keen interest in both traditional Apache culture and modern science. He often accompanied Sarah on house calls to elderly community members, serving as both translator and cultural liaison. His dream, he had recently announced, was to become a doctor like Sarah, but one who combined traditional healing practices with modern medicine. On this particular autumn morning, Sarah was preparing for what had become one of her favorite parts of the week. The traditional healing workshop she co-facilitated with Martha Crow Dog, one of the reservation's most respected traditional healers. The workshop brought together traditional and modern medical approaches, creating a dialogue between different healing traditions that had proven beneficial for both practitioners and patients. As Sarah gathered her materials for the workshop, she noticed an unusual amount of activity outside the clinic. Several trucks had pulled up, and she could see Joseph talking animatedly with his brother Robert and several other men from the community. There seemed to be an air of excitement and anticipation that she couldn't quite identify. Tommy burst through the clinic door with his characteristic energy, but today there was something different about his excitement. He was practically vibrating with contained news, bouncing from foot to foot as he approached Sarah's desk. Dr. Sarah, something really important is happening today, he announced, his eyes bright with anticipation. What's going on, Tommy? Sarah asked, setting down her workshop materials to give him her full attention. I can't tell you. It's a surprise. But Daddy says you need to come outside right now, and you need to wear your nice dress, and you need to bring your special beaded bracelet. Sarah looked at Tommy with amused confusion. The beaded bracelet he was referring to was the one his mother had made, which Tommy had given her after the scorpion incident. Sarah wore it every day, but she was puzzled by why Tommy would specifically mention it now. Tommy, what kind of surprise requires my nice dress at 10 in the morning? But Tommy just grinned and grabbed her hand. Come on, everyone's waiting. Mystified but curious, Sarah allowed Tommy to lead her outside, where she found not just Joseph and his family, but what appeared to be a significant portion of the reservation community gathered around the clinic. Elder tribal members sat in chairs that had been arranged in a semicircle, while younger community members stood behind them. Martha Crow Dog was there, dressed in her finest traditional clothing and carrying what Sarah recognized as ceremonial items. Joseph approached her, and Sarah could see a mix of nervousness and excitement in his expression. He too was dressed in his best traditional clothing, and he carried himself with a formality that suggested this was indeed a significant occasion. Sarah, he said, taking her hands in his, there's something I need to ask you, and I wanted to do it in the proper way, with the blessing and witness of our community. Sarah felt her heart begin to race as she started to understand what might be happening. Around them, the gathered community members had fallen silent, and she could feel the weight of their attention and expectations. Joseph reached into a leather pouch he carried and withdrew something that made Sarah gasp. It was a traditional Apache wedding medallion, intricately crafted with silver and turquoise hanging from a carefully beaded chain. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly the work of a master artisan, and the design incorporated symbols that Sarah had learned represented protection, love, and family unity. Sarah Mitchell, Joseph said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathering. 6 months ago, you saved my son's life. But more than that, you saved our lives. You brought love and healing into our family, and you've become an essential part of our community. Tommy, and I cannot imagine our future without you in it. He knelt down on one knee, still holding the medallion, and Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized what was happening. Will you marry me? Joseph asked. Will you become my wife and Tommy's mother, not just in our hearts, but in the eyes of our community and according to our traditions? The gathering held its breath as Sarah looked down at Joseph, then at Tommy, who was beaming with excitement, then at the faces of the community members who had become her extended family. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from the frightened young doctor who had arrived on the reservation to the woman who had found her home and purpose in this desert community. Yes, she said, her voice strong and clear despite the tears on her cheeks. Yes, I will marry you. A cheer went up from the gathered community as Joseph stood and carefully placed the wedding medallion around Sarah's neck. Tommy ran to them and threw his arms around both of them, creating a three-person hug that symbolized their family unity. Martha Crow Dog approached them, carrying a traditional blessing bundle. "Dr. Sarah," she said formally, "the community has asked me to perform the engagement blessing according to our traditions. Are you willing to participate in our customs?" Sarah nodded, understanding that this was another level of acceptance and integration into the community. "I would be honored." What followed was a beautiful ceremony that Sarah had never witnessed before. Martha Crow Dog led the community in traditional blessings for the engaged couple, calling upon the spirits of the four directions to protect and guide their union. Sarah and Joseph were given traditional foods to share, symbolizing their commitment to provide for each other, and their hands were bound together with a ceremonial cord while the community sang ancient songs of blessing. During the ceremony, Sarah learned that the wedding medallion had been crafted specifically for her by Robert Crow Feather, Joseph's uncle and one of the most respected silversmiths on the reservation. The turquoise had been mined from traditional Apache lands, and the silver work incorporated symbols that told the story of her journey from outsider to community member to family. After the formal engagement ceremony, the gathering transformed into a celebration feast. Tables appeared as if by magic, loaded with traditional foods that represented the best of Apache cuisine. There was fry bread and acorn stew, roasted corn and traditional teas, and modern dishes that showed how the community had adapted their food traditions to contemporary life. As Sarah moved through the celebration, accepting congratulations and good wishes from community members, she was struck by how naturally this moment had evolved from everything that had come before. The emergency that had brought her into Joseph and Tommy's lives had set in motion a series of events that felt both surprising and inevitable. Tommy stayed close to her throughout the celebration, proudly introducing her to relatives as "my new mom," and explaining to anyone who would listen how she had saved his life and how his father had fallen in love with her. His joy was infectious, and Sarah found herself laughing more than she had in years. During a quiet moment in the celebration, Joseph's grandmother, a tiny woman in her 90s who commanded enormous respect within the community, approached Sarah. Her English was limited, but her message was clear. "You good woman," she said, taking Sarah's hands in her weathered ones. "You bring healing to our family, to our community. My grandson, choose well." "Thank you," Sarah replied. "Your family has given me more than I ever dreamed possible." The old woman nodded approvingly. "Apache way is to take care of each other. You understand this. You live this. Now you're Apache too." As the celebration continued into the afternoon, Sarah and Joseph found themselves making plans for their wedding, which would take place according to traditional Apache customs with adaptations that honored both their backgrounds. They would have a ceremonial Apache wedding followed by a legal ceremony that would make their union official in both communities. But before the wedding planning could get too far, there was one conversation that needed to happen. Tommy appeared at their side, looking unusually serious for a child caught up in such a joyful celebration. "Dr. Sarah," he said formally, "when you marry Daddy, will you really be my mom?" Sarah knelt down to meet Tommy at eye level, understanding the importance of this question for a child who had lost his birth mother at such a young age. "Tommy, I will never try to replace your first mom. She will always be your mother, and I hope you'll always remember her and honor her memory. But if you want me to, I would be honored to be your second mom, to love you and take care of you and help you grow up to be the amazing man I know you'll become." Tommy considered this seriously, as he did most important matters. "Would I call you Mom? You can call me whatever feels right to you. Dr. Sarah, Sarah, Mom, whatever makes you comfortable." Tommy nodded decisively. "I think I like to call you Mom Sarah. That way everyone knows you're my mom, but you're also still my doctor." Sarah felt her heart swell with love for this wise, resilient child. "Mom Sarah sounds perfect to me." As the celebration began to wind down in the early evening, Sarah found herself standing with Joseph and Tommy, looking out over the reservation landscape that had become so dear to her. The desert was particularly beautiful at this time of day, with the setting sun painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Are you nervous about getting married?" Joseph asked, slipping his arm around her waist. Sarah considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "Not about marrying you or becoming Tommy's mother. I'm completely certain about that. But about doing justice to Apache traditions, about being worthy of the acceptance your community has shown me." Joseph smiled, pulling her closer. "You've already proven yourself worthy 100 times over. The community wouldn't have blessed this engagement if they had any doubts about your commitment to our ways. Tommy leaned against Sarah's other side, and she wrapped her arm around him. Besides, he added with the confidence of childhood, you're already part of our family. The wedding just makes it official. As they stood there together, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. The woman who had reluctantly accepted an assignment to a remote reservation clinic had found not just a career, but a calling. Not just a job, but a home. Not just patients, but a community. And not just professional satisfaction, but a family that loved her unconditionally. The engagement had been a surprise, but it was also the natural culmination of a journey that had begun with a scorpion sting and a desperate race to save a child's life. Every challenge she had faced, every cultural barrier she had worked to overcome, every moment of doubt and uncertainty had led to this moment of perfect clarity about where she belonged and with whom she was meant to share her life. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah made a silent promise to herself, to Joseph, to Tommy, and to the community that had embraced her. She would spend the rest of her life honoring the trust they had placed in her, serving the people who had become her people, and raising the child who had become her son. The wedding would be beautiful, she knew, but the real ceremony, the one that had transformed her from an outsider into a family member, had already taken place over months of shared experiences, mutual respect, and growing love. The formal celebration would simply announce to the world what their hearts already knew. They were meant to be together, and their union would strengthen not just their individual lives, but the entire community that had brought them together. Tomorrow would bring the practical details of wedding planning, the logistics of merging their lives more formally, and the ongoing work of building a marriage across cultural boundaries. But tonight, they were simply a family standing together under the vast Arizona sky, grateful for the unexpected turns of fate that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. The morning of Sarah and Joseph's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Arizona weather that seemed almost too good to be true. Sarah woke before sunrise in the guest room of Martha Crow Dog's house, where she had spent the night according to Apache tradition. The bride and groom were not supposed to see each other on their wedding day until the ceremony began, and the community had taken this tradition seriously, organizing the entire day around maintaining that separation while ensuring both bride and groom were properly prepared for their union. Sarah's nervousness was tempered by excitement and a deep sense of rightness about the day ahead. Over the past 3 months of wedding planning, she had learned more about Apache marriage traditions than she had ever imagined existed. The ceremony would blend ancient customs with modern adaptations, creating something that honored both Joseph's heritage and Sarah's background while emphasizing their commitment to building a life together within the Apache community. Martha Crow Dog appeared in the doorway with a cup of traditional tea and a gentle smile. "Today you become Apache wife," she said in her accented English. "You ready?" Sarah nodded, accepting the tea gratefully. "I think so. I feel ready." "Good. Your heart knows what it wants. Today just ceremony to tell everyone else." Over the next few hours, Sarah was surrounded by Apache women who helped her prepare for the ceremony. Her wedding dress was a magnificent creation that combined traditional Apache elements with contemporary design. The bodice was made of soft buckskin decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of her journey to the reservation and her integration into the community. The skirt was layers of flowing fabric and colors that represented the 4 directions sacred to Apache culture: white for east, blue for south, yellow for west, and black for north. The most meaningful part of her wedding attire was a cape that had been made by Joseph's late wife's mother. When Joseph had asked Sarah to marry him, his former mother-in-law had approached him with the offer to create something special for the wedding. The cape was a masterpiece of traditional craftsmanship, incorporating feathers, beadwork, and symbols that represented protection, love, and the blessing of Tommy's birth mother on their union. She wanted you to have something that connected you to Tommy's first mom. Joseph's aunt explained as she helped Sarah drape the cape properly. She said any woman good enough for Joseph, and Tommy was good enough to wear her daughter's blessing. Sarah was moved to tears by this gesture, understanding the profound generosity and acceptance it represented. To have the blessing of Joseph's late wife's family was a gift she had never expected but deeply treasured. As the women finished preparing her for the ceremony, Sarah could hear the sounds of the celebration beginning outside. The wedding was taking place at the same ceremonial grounds where she had attended her first sunrise ceremony, and the entire reservation community had turned out for the occasion. Guests had been arriving since dawn, setting up camps and preparing for what would be a 3-day celebration of the union. Tommy appeared in the preparation area, dressed in his finest traditional clothing and barely containing his excitement. "Mom, Sarah, you look so beautiful. Wait until Daddy sees you. He's going to cry." Sarah knelt down to hug Tommy, careful not to disturb her elaborate preparations. "How is your daddy doing? Is he nervous?" Tommy giggled. "He keeps asking Uncle Robert if he looks okay and checking his hair in the mirror. Uncle Robert says he's never seen Daddy so worried about anything except when I got bit by the scorpion." The comparison made Sarah smile, remembering how Joseph's calm strength during that crisis had been one of the things that first drew her to him. Now he was nervous about their wedding, which seemed sweetly human and endearing. As the time for the ceremony approached, Sarah was led to a traditional wickiup that had been constructed specifically for the wedding. According to Apache tradition, the bride entered the ceremonial space first, representing her willingness to create a new home and family. The wedding guests formed a large circle around the ceremonial area, with tribal elders occupying places of honor closest to where the actual ceremony would take place. Sarah took her position in the center of the circle, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but also the warmth of a community that had truly embraced her as one of their own. She could see patients she had treated, children she had helped heal, elders who had taught her about Apache traditions, and friends who had become like family over the past year and a half. When Joseph appeared at the edge of the circle, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. He was magnificent in his traditional Apache wedding attire, a white buckskin shirt decorated with silver conchos and intricate beadwork traditional pants, and moccasins that had been made specifically for this day. His long hair was braided with ceremonial feathers and silver ornaments, and he carried himself with a dignity and pride that took Sarah's breath away. But what moved her most was the look in his eyes as he saw her for the first time in her wedding attire. Tommy had been right. There were definitely tears forming, and the love and wonder in Joseph's expression made Sarah's heart race with happiness. The ceremony began with traditional Apache blessings performed by the tribal council chairman and several respected elders. Sarah and Joseph were blessed with sacred pollen, and prayers were offered for their health, fertility, prosperity, and long life together. The entire community joined in traditional wedding songs that had been sung at Apache ceremonies for generations. Then came the exchange of vows, which they had written together to reflect both their personal commitments and their understanding of Apache marriage traditions. Joseph spoke first, his voice strong and clear as he addressed not just Sarah, but the entire community. "Sarah Mitchell, you came to our reservation as a healer, and you have healed not just our bodies, but our hearts. You saved my son's life, and in doing so, you gave us both a new life filled with love and hope. I promise to honor you as my wife, to protect you as my family, and to work beside you to serve our community. I promise to teach you our ways while learning from yours, and to raise our son to be proud of both his Apache heritage and the strong woman who chose to become his mother." When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she looked out at the faces surrounding them, faces that had become as familiar and dear to her as any family she had ever known. "Joseph Crow Feather, when I came to this reservation, I thought I was here to give medical care to your community. But instead, your community gave me something I didn't even know I was looking for: a home, a purpose, and a family. You and Tommy have taught me that healing is about more than medicine. It's about love, community, and the courage to open your heart to people who might seem different from you. I promise to be your wife with all my heart, to be Tommy's mother with all my love, and to serve this community with all my skills and dedication for the rest of my life." The formal vows were followed by the traditional Apache wedding rituals. Sarah and Joseph shared food from the same bowl, symbolizing their commitment to provide for each other. They were wrapped together in a wedding blanket that had been woven by the women of the community, representing their union and the community's support for their marriage. Their hands were bound together with cords made from traditional Apache materials, while the community sang blessings for their fertility and happiness. The most emotional moment came when Tommy, was formally included in the ceremony. According to Apache tradition, when a person married someone with children, they also formally adopted those children as their own. Sarah and Tommy participated in a modified adoption ceremony that made her legally and culturally his mother while honoring the memory of his birth mother. Tommy Crow Feather, the tribal chairman, said formally, "Do you accept Sarah Mitchell as your mother to love and honor as long as you both shall live?" Tommy's response was so enthusiastic it drew laughter from the entire gathering. "Yes, I accept Mom Sarah as my mother forever and ever." Sarah knelt down and embraced Tommy as the community erupted in cheers and celebration. In that moment, she felt the final piece of her transformation falling into place. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the outsider serving a remote community. She was Sarah Crow Feather, wife, mother, and full member of the Apache Nation. The formal ceremony concluded with the couple being blessed by water from the sacred springs and pollen from traditional Apache plants. They were presented with wedding gifts from the community, practical items for their household, traditional crafts that would connect them to Apache culture, and modern conveniences that acknowledged their contemporary life. As the ceremonial portion of the wedding ended and the celebration feast began, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support from the community. Every person who approached her had words of blessing and welcome, stories of how her medical care had helped them or their families, and expressions of joy that she had chosen to make the reservation her permanent home. The feast was magnificent, featuring both traditional Apache foods and contemporary dishes that reflected the community's adaptation to modern life. Long tables groaned under the weight of fry bread and acorn stew, roasted corn, and traditional teas, as well as barbecued beef and modern side dishes that showed how Apache culture had evolved while maintaining its core values. During the meal, Joseph's uncle Robert stood to make a toast that captured the significance of the day. Today we celebrate not just the marriage of Joseph and Sarah, but the completion of a journey that began when a small boy was bitten by a scorpion and a young doctor chose to go beyond her duty to save his life. Sarah, you have shown us what it means to truly serve a community, to become part of a people rather than just working among them. Joseph, you have found a woman worthy of your late wife's blessing and strong enough to help you raise a son who will bridge two worlds. Tommy, you are blessed to have two mothers who loved you enough to give you the best of both their cultures. As the formal celebration continued into the evening, Sarah and Joseph found moments to steal away together, marveling at how perfectly their wedding day was unfolding. They walked to a quiet spot overlooking the ceremonial grounds, where they could see their entire community celebrating their union. "Any regrets?" Joseph asked, taking her hand and admiring the traditional wedding ring he had placed there during the ceremony. Sarah looked out at the celebration, at Tommy running among his cousins, at the faces of people who had become her family, at the desert landscape that had become her home. "Only one," she said with a smile. Joseph raised an eyebrow, concerned. "What's that?" "That it took a scorpion's sting to bring us together. I wish I had found you and Tommy and this community sooner." Joseph laughed, pulling her close. "Apache tradition says that everything happens when it's supposed to happen. You came to us exactly when we needed you, and exactly when you needed us." As if summoned by their conversation, Tommy appeared at their side, slightly out of breath from playing, but eager to include them in whatever adventure he had discovered. "Mom Sarah, Daddy, come on. Grandma Martha is going to tell the story about the first Apache wedding, and she says it's important for new married people to hear it." Hand in hand, the three of them walked back toward the celebration, ready to continue learning the traditions that would guide their life together. As they rejoined the community gathering, Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns of life that had brought her to this moment. The scared young woman who had responded to a medical emergency 18 months ago could never have imagined that she would end this day as a wife, mother, and permanent member of the Apache community. But sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single act of compassion, and sometimes saving one child's life becomes the moment when you discover the life you were meant to live. The celebration continued late into the night, with traditional dancing, storytelling, and songs that connected the present moment to centuries of Apache heritage. Sarah danced her first dance as a married woman with her new husband, then with her son, then with seemingly every member of the community who wanted to welcome her officially into their family. As the stars wheeled overhead and the celebration finally began to wind down, Sarah and Joseph prepared to leave for their new home, a house they had built together on land that the tribal council had granted them as a wedding gift. Tommy would stay with his grandmother for the next few days, giving the newlyweds time to begin their married life while he enjoyed being spoiled by his extended family. As they drove away from the ceremonial grounds, Sarah looked back one last time at the gathering that had transformed her from Sarah Mitchell into Sarah Crow Feather. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities as she navigated married life within Apache culture while continuing to serve as the community's doctor. There would be cultural adjustments to make, family dynamics to negotiate, and the ongoing work of building a marriage that honored both their backgrounds. But tonight, she was simply a woman who had found her home, her family, and her purpose in the most unexpected place. The journey that had begun with a scorpion sting and a frightened father's desperate plea for help had led her to a love story that was both deeply personal and profoundly connected to a community's traditions and values. As they pulled up to their new home, Sarah realized that this wasn't just the end of her wedding day. It was the beginning of a life she had never dared to dream possible. In saving Tommy Crow Feather's life, she had inadvertently saved her own, discovering that sometimes the greatest healing happens not to the patient, but to the healer who learns to open her heart to unexpected possibilities. The little house welcomed them with warmth and promise, ready to shelter their growing family and serve as a gathering place for the community that had given them so much. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called across the desert, its voice carrying blessings for the future and gratitude for the mysterious ways that love finds its path through even the most challenging circumstances.